Welcome. It's so nice to see so many of you here on such a cold night. We'll try and warm you up a little bit with some intellectual conversation and some provocative ideas. I'm Louis Johnston. I'm privileged to hold the Joseph P. Ferry Professorship in the McCarthy Center for Civic Engagement and Public Policy. I'm also a professor in the Department of Economics. I just want to do three quick things here before I turn it over to our distinguished guest. First of all, I want to thank a few people. Then I want to say a few things about the Phi Beta Kappa Visiting Scholar Program. And finally, I just want to do a brief introduction. After Dr. McGarry's presentation, we'll have an opportunity for some audience questions. I'm going to take advantage and actually ask her a couple myself before you guys horn in. But we'll open it up and I'll play Oprah, and we have microphones over there and we can have a conversation. So this will be fun. So first, some thank yous. I want to thank the Phi Beta Kappa chapter, Phi Beta Kappa Theta of Minnesota chapter. That's our St. John's, St. Ben's chapter. Our president couldn't be here tonight. She's got 3 little kids, including a pair of twins, and she needs to get home. And so but she wanted me to make sure and convey her greetings and her welcome to you all. And I want to make sure and thank them because that's what makes this possible. Second, the McCarthy Center for Public Policy and Civic Engagement, especially, again, someone who's not here, Stacy Pink, and can we do an applause so that everybody knows we applauded? Stacy and the student volunteers and everyone at the center just do an amazing job, and I get to stand up here and say nice things and everything just happens. So it's amazing. Thank you, guys. And finally, the staff here at St. John's itself who made the dinner, served the dinner, set up the room, and did all the work to actually make this happen. I appreciate what they have to do, too. Second, let me just say a bit about the Phi Beta Kappa Visiting Scholar Program. This is from the Phi Beta Kappa materials itself. Since 1956, the Phi Beta Kappa Visiting Scholar Program has been offering undergraduates the opportunity to spend time with some of America's most distinguished scholars. The purpose of the program is to contribute to the intellectual life of the campus by making possible an exchange of ideas between the visiting scholars and the resident faculty and students. The visiting scholars travel to 100 colleges and universities each year, spending 2 days on each campus and taking full part in the academic life of the institution. They meet informally with students and faculty members, participate in classroom discussions and seminars, and give a public lecture, like tonight, open to the academic community and the general public. Over the last 58 years, 623 visiting scholars have made 5,092 visits to Phi Beta Kappa sheltering institutions. 3 of those visits have been to our campuses. We've been lucky enough to have that. Dr. McGarry is our 3rd Phi Beta Kappa visiting scholar. So finally, let me introduce Dr. Kathleen McGarry. Dr. McGarry is professor of economics and department chair at UCLA. I spent 3 years as a department chair here. I can't even imagine what being department chair at UCLA is like. I ran screaming from the job, so that alone is worth great praise. She's also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research and served as a staff economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors in 2000-2001. She earned her undergraduate degree, master's, and doctoral degrees from the State University of New York at Stony Brook. Her research focuses on the well-being of the elderly, with particular attention paid to public and private transfers, including Medicare and Social Security, and the transfer of resources within families, something I'm experiencing that my parents are in their 80s, and we're learning about that. That's a joke. Not a very good one either. Her research combines work on the financial aspects of aging with issues related to health economics to examine insurance coverage among the elderly. She's studied the long-term care, health, and life insurance markets, as well as the role played by families in providing insurance for their least well-off members. I'm particularly happy to welcome Dr. McGarry to campus because on July 30th, 1965, Lyndon Johnson traveled to Independence, Missouri to sign the legislation creating Medicare. In fact, there's a picture right there in the middle, we didn't plan this, of that signing ceremony. President Johnson signing the Medicare bill. On his left, our right, is former President Harry Truman, who first introduced this legislation in 1948. And just behind him is Senator, at that time Vice President, Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota, who co-sponsored that bill starting his first session in 1949 and helped sponsor it every year that he was in the Senate until he left to become vice president. So it's truly an honor to have Dr. McGarry here to talk about this because we've got a deep connection with that in this part of the world. And I should also note, at this ceremony, Truman became the first enrollee in Medicare. President Johnson gave him a card for being the first enrollee. I think 50 years later, it's hard to remember how revolutionary Medicare and the war on poverty were. Too often I hear people say, well, it was a noble effort, but really it was a failure, ultimately. I always point out that in media representations of poverty before 1965, what they usually showed was older men, older women living by themselves. That's not what you see today. If someone wants to represent poverty, they use a very different image than that. That, I think, is one of the big legacies of the war on poverty, and in particular, the introduction of Medicare. But I'm going to leave that to an expert. So join me in welcoming Kathleen McGarry.
Thank you very much. It's really an honor to be here, and I appreciate you all coming out on such a cold night. I have a lot of material here, and I'm going to plan to speak for 40 minutes and take questions. I'll be flipping through some slides very quickly, just in case I have them here in case somebody asks a question and we want to go back and look at something in more detail. Okay, so I'll plow through, and I'm happy with questions. You want them saved to the end, right?
Save it to the end.
Okay, so prior to the war on poverty rates across the country were extremely high, but they were particularly high for the elderly. The war on poverty, as we'll see, brought both cash transfers and in-kind transfers. So the Medicare and Medicaid programs are health insurance that go to the elderly. SSI is a welfare program for the elderly. Food stamps were a transfer. And then there were also an enormous number of programs not targeting the elderly. Head Start programs, college student loans, work study, all those things came from Lyndon Johnson. Job training programs, school lunch programs, things that you never consider part of the war on poverty were all included in this program. So it was enormous. And I'm going to focus on the elderly part today. Okay, this is just a picture of the poverty rates around the US. The darker colors are higher incidence of poverty. So just to give you a background on, we hear poverty rates talked about all the time. Every September, the Census Bureau releases numbers on the number of Americans in poverty, or the fraction who are poor. I worked as a senior economist at the White House, and the first thing I did for Bill Clinton was put together poverty numbers and release those. But we don't ever talk about where the poverty rate or the poverty line comes from. And it's really an amazing story. There's this woman named Molly Orshansky who worked at the Social Security Administration. She was a bureaucrat. And she wasn't anything special. She did a good job. They asked her, just come up with a quick estimate of the fraction who are poor. So what she did was she took the cost of feeding a family of 4 on the US Department of Agriculture's Economy Food Plan. At that time, people spent about 1/3 of their income on food. So she multiplied that number by 3. And it differed for the elderly and non-elderly because elderly needed fewer calories than non-elderly. It differed for men and women because men needed more calories than women. And it differed for farm and non-farm families. And that was it. It wasn't any sort of presidential commission on poverty. It wasn't an academic study, anything like that. It was a single person who worked at Social Security, did this sitting at her desk. And that was in 1961, and we've kept it ever since. We got rid of a couple things like male and female differences, but mostly all we've ever done is adjust it for inflation. And that's it. This number that we follow year in and year out, that we base this huge war on poverty on, was sort of done randomly. It doesn't make sense anymore in lots of ways. Food is really cheap. Nobody spends 1/3 of their income on food anymore. Right? You spend much less. So here are the poverty thresholds. In 1959, she was doing this in 61, went back to 59. You can see the difference for male and female. In 2013, we don't have a male-female difference anymore. It's an average of those two, basically, and brought up with the CPI. And that's it. For one person 65 and over, it's still less. Senior citizens need fewer calories, so they get a lower poverty line. So if you think of this, every time we talk about being poor here, we're thinking about $11,000 a year. So less than $1,000 a month that somebody's trying to live on. And that's to pay for housing and food and shelter and whatever medical care isn't covered and so forth. So poor is really pretty poor. It increases if you go to 2 people. Look how small the increase is. Right? It's about $3,500 for that second person. The idea is it's only the extra food. Right? You still have the same home, you have the same utility bills, the same automobile, things like that. And then as family size increases, you can see what that looks like. And I show you the numbers in '59 and today. So this is before the war on poverty. 1959 is the first year for which we have poverty rates. This is the poverty rate for the entire US population, 19%. You see it for what economists call prime age working people, 18 to 64, and then much higher for children. And there's the elderly. Okay, if you add the elderly in, they were much, much higher. Population as a whole, again, 19%, elderly, 35.2. And see something even more dramatic, this is basically widows, elderly women living alone. 63%, so almost 2/3 of elderly widows were poor. Remember, in today's dollars, that's $11,000 a year. Okay. So Lyndon Johnson announced the war on poverty in the State of the Union address, and you can read his text. I won't go through it. But he wanted to, our task is to help replace their despair with opportunity. The administration today, here and now, declares an unconditional war on poverty in America. I urge this Congress and all Americans to join with me in that effort. It's a really nice speech if you take time to go back and look at it. And here's what happened, going from 1959 to 2013. Poverty rates, as I said, are released every September, so you can get to 2014 rates in the coming September. So poverty rates fell 19 to 14% for prime age people and then for children. So people looked at these numbers and debated whether or not the war on poverty was a success. We spent a whole lot of money. We established a huge number of programs. And yeah, poverty rates fell. So you can say, yes, it's a success. What is it worth it, or so forth. But look at what happened to the elderly. Okay? There's a huge decline from 35.2 to 9.5. It's dramatic. Whatever happening was here, yes, there was some improvement, but you can't possibly argue that this wasn't an enormous success. That's a tremendous, tremendous difference. So what I'll talk about this evening is where we were, what was the condition when poverty rates were 35%, how did we get them down to 9%? And here it is graphically. You see that big drop off initially. Okay, so why was it so high? Why did it improve? So the big program for the elderly, and it existed before the war on poverty, was Social Security. It was established in 1935 and expanded greatly throughout the 40s and 50s. What's interesting about the program is that in the beginning, you only needed 3 years of work to become covered. They wanted to help people right away. This was during the Depression. People were suffering a great deal. They wanted to provide immediate coverage. You need now 40 covered quarters or 10 years of work to be insured. It wouldn't do much good in 1935 if you required people to work for 10 years. It would take a long time for people to get any benefits. So the first person, we saw the first person to get Medicare is Harry Truman. The first person to get a Social Security annuity check was a woman named Ida Mae Fuller, who lived in Ludlow, Vermont. Back then, you only had to work for 3 years to get benefits. She paid $24.75. She retired in 1939 at the age of 65. And here's her quote when she applied for benefits. It wasn't that I expected anything, mind you, but I knew I'd been paying for something called Social Security, and I wanted to ask the people in Rutland something about it. So Rutland was the big city next to Ludlow. And here she was. In life expectancy in 1935 was 67.1 years. So when you started Social Security, you kind of figured people would get it for about 2 years. She lived to age 100. And it's just shocking to me. I'm from Los Angeles now, right? You couldn't write a Hollywood script that said the very first person to collect Social Security just happened to live from 65 to 100. Nobody lived there. So she collected almost $23,000 in benefits, about 1,000 times the taxes paid. She did really well. So there's Ida. So just some characteristics of Social Security. One of the things about Social Security, it has a progressive benefit formula. Lower income workers get a larger return on the taxes they paid in. They get a larger fraction of their income covered under Social Security. There are also benefits for spouses and survivors. If you're married to someone who participates in Social Security, if you're married for 10 years, you get a spousal benefit equal to 50% of your partner's benefits, even if you never work. So that's a huge transfer from people who are single to people who are married with just one spouse. It's also a huge transfer from people where both spouses work to families where just one spouse works. And this was obviously because in 1935, most women didn't work, and this was a way to provide for them. An important aspect of Social Security is its annuity. You're going to get this monthly income for the rest of your life. That contrasts with what we see now, these 401ks, 403bs, where you get to save for your retirement. It's a retirement pension plan. When you retire, you have maybe $500,000 saved in this. You have to decide, are you going to live to 67, or are you going to live to 100, like Ida Mae Fuller? And how much do you take out every year? It's your responsibility to figure out what to do with that. If you live a long time, there's a good chance you run out of money. Social Security takes away that risk. The government spreads it out over everybody. Some people will die before they even collect Social Security, and they pay in way more than they ever give back. Some people live an extremely long time, and they get back much more than they ever paid in. But it sort of protects you against living too long. It provides insurance in that sense. And that would sort of help poverty among the very oldest. So here's the picture we heard about. When you used to think of the poor, you thought of old men. And this is a picture of talking old age assistance. This, in addition to Social Security, was the other government program that provided cash income to the elderly before the war on poverty. And old age assistance programs were back before Social Security started, back to the 1920s. When Social Security was enacted, 30 states had programs like these. And this was our first time as a country ever trying to help the elderly in a formal way with cash assistance. The Social Security Act helps states expand these by providing matching funds for benefits. One of the problems with this is these were state-run programs, and states differed greatly. So this is just an example, $34 in Mississippi to $94 in Wisconsin. So there are enormous differences in how wealthy states are, what they can afford to do, and what their attitudes towards helping the elderly were. There were also some restrictions on benefits. Lien laws meant that if you were collecting benefits from this old age assistance program, when you died, they could sell your house or your assets and pay back the state. So the idea was people might not want to participate in this program because they wanted to leave their home or their farm to their children, and in signing up for this program, getting benefits, the state could take that when you died. They also had relative responsibility clauses, and this was something that the students here would be interested in. If an elderly parent was going to collect benefits, they had to first prove that their children could not support them. Children were legally responsible for supporting their elderly parents. Your parents could not collect benefits unless they first sue, or the state would sue you in court to get the money from you. So that's something that we used to have and no longer have. There were also state residency requirements, not US residency, but if you moved, say, to Minnesota to be closer to your children, you wouldn't qualify for benefits because you were a new resident of the state. So that was hard for a country to have, and it was not an entitlement. It was often only paid partial benefits. If the state ran out of money mid-year, they'd stop paying. Or if the state couldn't help everybody who qualified, they wouldn't get it. So there were some issues with this program, but it was an attempt to provide some sort of income for the poor elderly. Okay, so despite the problems with that program and the fact that most of you probably never even heard of it, in 1950 there were more people receiving old age assistance than Social Security. So it was an important program. You can see the numbers, 2.8 million versus 2.1. Those receiving old age assistance had a very low income. The average income was just $1,800, which is the equivalent of $9,700. And remember, the poverty line is about $12,000. So people were very poor. So that's the situation. That's sort of where things stood. We had Social Security. Not everybody was entitled. It hadn't yet grown. And we had old age assistance that differed very much by state. Some states were generous. Some states couldn't afford to be generous or chose not to be. And then Lyndon Johnson came out and declared a war on poverty. And these are the central components that related to the elderly. They said it was a responsibility of the government to assist our older people to secure equal opportunity to the full and free enjoyment of the following objectives: adequate income, suitable housing, and no discriminatory personnel practices based on age. Okay. So the elderly were singled out in his speech, that was something we were going to pay attention to. And where things stood, 75% of the elderly received Social Security. The average worker benefit was just $600 in 2013 dollars. And then what happened? As soon as the war on poverty began, 1965, first year, there's a 7% increase in Social Security benefits. 1967, there was a 13% increase in Social Security benefits. Johnson declared when he signed this act that this means 9 million people will have risen above the poverty line since the beginning of 1964. Okay, so there was a big increase immediately after the declaration of the war on poverty, 20% about. And then after Johnson came Nixon, and the trend continued. The Tax Reform Act of 1969 had a 15% increase in Social Security. 1971, there was another 10% increase. 1972, a 20% increase. So this is enormous. Year after year after year, Congress was voting these enormous benefits. If you compound those, you get an 85% increase in Social Security benefits from 1964 to 1972. 8 years, and benefits increased by 85%. And they realized this was, there's a very interesting, if you read the political economy story behind this and what was going on in politics, but you couldn't keep having Congress vote benefit increases like this. In 1972, they just indexed it to benefits. They indexed it for inflation. And here's what happened. Here's that period, 1969 to 1972, that big run-up in benefits. Okay. And here's what happened to the poverty. That thick blue line is the elderly. You see it started out much higher than all these other groups. The yellow-greenish one is under 18, the children, and the reddish one is prime-age workers. So you see they all fell with this war on poverty. The other thing to note is the war on poverty started here, so poverty rates were already falling. But you had that huge, deep drop right when the increase in Social Security happened. The other thing to note here is you see sort of around 1975, 79, the poverty rate for children increases a little bit, stays relatively flat. The poverty rate for prime-age workers increases a little, then stays relatively flat. The elderly continues to fall. That's linked to that indexation of the Social Security benefit. We keep increasing Social Security benefits. They're adjusted for increases in labor market earnings, and then they're adjusted for the CPI. So even when we have things like welfare reform over here that might increase poverty among children, something the elderly have been protected. Their Social Security has not been touched, so you continue to see this gradual decline. Okay, so that's Social Security. The other big program is SSI, and this, like some of those increases in Social Security, is part of Richard Nixon's administration. So Richard Nixon came into office and he looked at all these welfare programs around the country. Old age assistance, we also had AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children, and they differ tremendously across states. He thought that was really silly. He wanted to have a family assistance plan, just sort of one welfare program nationwide. The only part of that plan that passed was the plan that helped the elderly, the blind, and the disabled. So that led to replacing the Old Age Assistance program with something called Supplemental Security Income, or SSI. So what SSI is, it's a guaranteed minimum income for the elderly, for the blind, and for the disabled. And I'll just talk about the elderly here. So it started in 1974 with benefits of $140 a month for single people, $210 for married people. In 2014, the numbers were $712 and $1,082. So remember, the poverty line for a single elderly person now is $931. We're guaranteeing a minimum income of $712. So that's a little odd when I look at it. We're worried about poverty. We have this sort of anti-poverty program to help the low-income elderly, but we choose a guaranteed income that's below the poverty line, which they're better off than if they didn't have it, certainly, but it's interesting to think about where that line, how that was determined. Why do we pick a number below the poverty line? So eligibility for SSI depends on income. You have to have low income. and you have to have low assets. Now, they don't count all your income. What they do is they take the income guarantee. So if you're a single person, that income guarantee is $712. Your benefits equal to the income guarantee less your countable income. If your countable income is $700, you get $12. If your countable income is $600, you get $112. You get whatever you need to bring you up to that floor. To arrive at countable income, you get $20 of Social Security income, they don't count. And then if you have some earnings, they don't count that. So you can have a little more than the guaranteed amount. For assets, you can have to have less than $2,000 if you're a single person, $3,000 if you're a couple. So you're really poor to participate in this program. You have income of less than $700, assets of less than $2,000. But excluded from assets are the value of a home, a car, and burial plots, and life insurance. The idea behind this is they were very worried that the elderly would not participate in this program because they wanted to leave a house for their children. So they didn't want to force the elderly to sell their homes, so they let them keep it. Now, states can add on to this program and increase the benefit levels if they want to. And most states do something. But this is guaranteed at the federal level no matter where you live. The program's become less generous over time. The original asset limits were $1,500 and $2,250. In 1989, they were increased to $2,000 and $3,000 for singles and couples, and they've been unchanged ever since. So this is an interesting characteristic that you can see in sort of lots of government programs. Sometimes things are named in nominal terms. And then over time, the value sort of deteriorates. Having $2,000 back in 1989 is very different from having $2,000 now. Right? That hasn't been adjusted for inflation. So in some sense, the program has become less generous. If you took those initial values, brought them up to $2,012, they would be $7,000 and $10,500. Okay, so this just shows you the differences across some states. States can add to them. So you get the same things. Alaska's a very wealthy state. They have very high benefits. California tends to be fairly generous. Michigan, Massachusetts, and so forth. Okay, so what did these programs do for the well-being of the elderly? Well, there are a couple of economists, Gary Engelhardt and John Gruber, who you've all heard about in the healthcare debate probably. So they argue that Social Security is responsible for the entire decline of poverty. And here's a picture to illustrate that. The red line is the poverty rate, the blue line is average Social Security benefits. They're pretty much mirror images of each other. Right? Social Security goes up, poverty rates go down. And doing some sort of accounting, they believe that just about all that decline is due simply to Social Security. So talking about how Social Security is doing some sort of redistribution, as I said earlier, it's a progressive benefit schedule that would transfer resources from rich to poor. The benefit formula is such that lower income workers get a higher return on their benefits. That's how it was set up. That was intended. Everybody's sort of aware of that. Then there are other parts of it that are less obvious. It's a regressive tax structure. Social Security taxes are only paid up to $117,000. Beyond that, you don't pay taxes. So if your income's lower, you're paying tax on everything. If you have really high income, you're only paying tax on a portion. So that means it's a regressive tax structure. Lower income workers pay a higher share of their income in taxes than do higher income workers. The other parts are even less clear. Because it's this annuity you're going to get for your whole life, if you live a really long time, you do well. If you have a short life expectancy, you don't do so well. Well, who has a long life expectancy? Women live longer than men. Women get more back from Social Security than men do. Congress is not going to pass a law saying women get lower benefits, so the expected amount is even. They won't, so women do better. Whites live longer than blacks, so whites benefit disproportionately from the program. Higher educated people live longer than people with lower education, and so forth. There's also that transfer I mentioned before, single people versus couples with one earner. If you're a single person, you work your whole life, you get 1 times your benefit, your primary insurance amount. If you're married and your spouse doesn't work, you get 1.5 times your benefit. So you get that extra 50% for free. So that's a transfer from one group of people to the other. There are also some interesting non-income effects from Social Security. It's been responsible, they think, for a decline in labor force participation and for spikes in retirement at given ages. So here's the decline in labor force participation for men 65 and older. When Social Security was early and not too generous, about 45% of those 65 and older were working. It plummeted to about 13%. Started to turn around recently. But there was a huge drop because people were better off. They were getting generous Social Security. They didn't have to work. And here's another one. Social Security, used to be able to you could collect benefits first at age 62. They're reduced relative to what they would be at your full retirement age. And you see these spikes, a big spike at 62. There's no reason to retire at age 62 except for Social Security. You see a big spike at 65. Again, that's Social Security. So you see people are responding in their employment to Social Security. They're less likely to work. They retire at these key Social Security ages. The other one that's really interesting is marriage. This is something that economists talk about all the time, and people sort of scoff that only economists think of these weird things. If you want to get those spousal benefits, that 50% of your spouse, you have to be married for 10 years. So there's a spike in divorce at 10 years. The other thing, if you're a widow and you're widowed or you're divorced and you're collecting off your first husband's earnings, if you remarry before age 60, you lose it. So you have to wait to age 60 if you want to keep your former spouse's earnings. So, most people would say, that's crazy. Who's going to pay attention to this law and wait till age 60 to marry? If you want to get married, you're going to get married. So here's marriage rates for widows around their 60th birthday. There's this huge jump exactly at age 60. So people know these characteristics of the law and they respond to them. So if you're thinking of going to public policy or working for state or federal government, there are all these unintended consequences of laws. You have to pick a number. Randomly, you pick 60 or 62 for retirement or something. People are going to respond to it. And as weird as economists think of for coming up with all these things, people actually do them. So you can think very carefully about law and look at some of the effects of some of these things. So SSI, I'll skip a bit. I just want to talk about a couple other things. One of the interesting aspects of SSI, this is a welfare program, guaranteed income. You have to be really poor, right? You have income below $700 a month, no income, no assets, less than $2,000, you're really poor. But people don't enroll in the program. When first measured in 1974, that's when the program went into effect, only about 55% of those who looked to be entitled for benefits were actually enrolled in the program. So I did, back when I was in graduate school in 1990s, I went back and got 1984 data and said, well, 74 was the first year. Of course people weren't enrolling, nobody knew about it. Let's look 10 years after the program's inception. Got the exact same number, 55%. Then I did it with 1993 data. Okay, we're gonna have to 20 years. Got the same number. You keep finding that only about 50 to 55% of the elderly are enrolled in the program. And if you speculate as to why, it could be you don't know about the program. I imagine many of you here tonight did not know the SSI program existed. When I started working about it in my thesis and I told my advisor I was gonna work on SSI, he said, oh, Social Security income. And I said, no, it's a supplemental security income program. I won't tell you who my advisor at that time was. So it could be you didn't know about it. It could be the application process is too difficult. It could be the stigma of accepting welfare or just not feeling needy enough. So this is what they saw over time. It stayed at 50%. And since 1993, we've had these enormous economic changes, right? There's been welfare reform that changed the way the country thought about welfare and the way we handled it. There was a huge economic and housing boom. Then there was a huge recession and housing bust. So you'd expect there might be changes in participation in this welfare program. Elderly own a lot of homes, they might change things and so forth. So I went ahead and did it for all these years, and it stayed exactly the same. That number just doesn't seem to budge. And if you think about those explanations I showed, first one was lack of knowledge. People didn't know about it. Well, there have been a huge number of outreach programs. There was one in St. Louis back when the program first started. I think it was 1975. If you brought in an eligible elderly person and got them to enroll in SSI, you got $50. And they were expecting, that's a lot of money back then. And they were expecting a huge number of applicants. They got almost none. So the best way to decide if you're eligible for SSI is to look at your Social Security check. That's the only income most people get. So Social Security looks at your Social Security check. If it looks low enough, they send you a note that says, it looks like you would qualify for benefits. Give us a call. If you're worried about it, they also did this door-to-door canvassing. They did advertising. They do things at senior citizen centers and so forth. In efforts to reduce stigma, it used to be that Social Security checks were one color. SSI checks sent to you by the Social Security Administration were another color. They thought, well, maybe people are embarrassed to go to the bank because the teller will know they're getting welfare. You know, and a lot of people live in small towns. You know the teller. You don't want everybody in town knowing you're getting public assistance. So they changed the color of the check to make them look just like Social Security checks. That didn't change anything. Now everything's electronic deposits. Nothing has changed. So we haven't been able to get people to enroll in this program. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe they don't need money. Or maybe it's a bad thing because we have people with this really low income levels, really low asset levels who aren't getting the help that's there for them. An alternative would be a minimum Social Security benefit. The problem with that is you can't target it to the needy. There could be people who have very low Social Security benefits because they didn't work in covered employment, they had trust funds, they had enormous amounts of assets, something like that, and you wouldn't know it just by looking at Social Security. So we haven't gone ahead and done that. And this will just show you how the components of income differ across. This is the lowest, 25% of the population. The big red part is Social Security. So if you're at the bottom, just about all your income comes from Social Security. If you're in the highest 25%, that big blue region is earnings, and this is Social Security, and this is asset income. So there's a very different picture. And so this is why Social Security made such a huge difference in those poverty rates. It's a big deal for people in the lower end of the distribution. That's where their income comes from. SSI is that tiny, that grayish point there. Okay, so just some problems that still remain with poverty. Poverty rate for blacks fell from 62.5% to 21.9%. So in some sense, we did really well in fighting poverty among blacks, but the poverty rate for whites is 7.7%. So there's the exact same percentage difference now than there used to be. The poverty rate for elderly Hispanics is 18%. And those are the differences by race. The blacks are green, then the Hispanics, then the whites. There's also, I showed you that huge poverty rate for elderly women living alone. It was 63%. It's down to 19%, but it's 5% for married women. Okay, so there's still an enormous difference. And if you look at black and Hispanic women, black women living alone is 44%, Hispanic women living alone is 58%. Those are enormous. More than half Hispanic women are poor. Right, so we've sort of left out some groups in this. And in the last 2 minutes or so, I'll just talk about some other issues that affect poverty in ways that we don't measure. Okay, Medicare is this enormously generous health insurance program for the elderly. It doesn't figure anywhere in our poverty calculations. Right, so we're not counting that benefit that's worth a whole lot. If you were to buy that, it would cost you thousands of dollars, but it doesn't enter in it. It covers prescription drugs, it covers hospital and doctor visits. There's Medicaid, which is additional health insurance for the poor, which fills in the gaps left by the Medicare program. There's food stamps that are available to the elderly and to the poor. And these are all admitted from the poverty calculations. Other things, we don't have the value of an owner-occupied home. If you own a home and you've paid off the mortgage and you have the same income as somebody who's renting, you're going to be better off. But there's no allowance for that in our poverty rate. If you have a huge amount of assets, you have a couple $100,000 sitting under the mattress, and your next door neighbor doesn't, and you have the same income, we're saying you're the same poverty rate because we don't count assets at all. We don't count home production, the ability to, garden, to prepare your own food, things like that. So these are all resources that we don't count. On the other hand, we don't count costs. We don't count medical expenses. The elderly have much higher out-of-pocket medical expenses than the non-elderly, and we don't make allowance from that. There's a new supplemental poverty measure that does try to take account of medical expenses. Okay, so this will just show you graphically, this is home ownership rates. So people under 35, less than 40% own a home. People 65 and over, 80% own a home. So if we're comparing poverty among the elderly and non-elderly, we're sort of missing additional gains for the elderly because we're not counting home ownership. Here are assets for people younger than 35 in 1984 and 2009. People are doing worse. Here are assets for those 65 and over. They're doing better. We don't count assets in our poverty rate. We count asset income if you're getting income from it, but we don't count the stock of assets. What economists will tell you is we have something called a life cycle model where you're supposed to save your whole life, and then when you retire, you start spending down that savings, and the goal is to die with exactly $0. We call that cap T. Cap T is when time ends. So you're supposed to be spending this down. So it should, some part of it should count as your income. And we don't count it. So that also helps. There are also other gains that we ignore. Living arrangements. In 1940, 18% of elderly widows lived alone. In 1990, 62% lived alone. That's a huge gain. If you have income just below the poverty line, you can afford to live alone now, whereas you might not be able to. So you might look poor, whereas in previous decades, you were living with a child, so you didn't look poor because you were in some other family that had high income. So are you better off? Probably, right? You get your independence, but you now look poor where you wouldn't have before. So this is a graph of widows living alone. It's gone up greatly over time. Other gains, there's been this trend towards early retirement. Social Security now exists, you can retire early. If you have income just below the poverty line and are not working, are you better off than somebody whose income just above the poverty line and is? Right? We're not taking into account that leisure, what you gain from it. There's a difference in labor force participation. There it is, we saw it before. Life expectancy. There's been a big improvement in life expectancy since the war on poverty. From 14.3 to 18.6 years, we don't account that in our poverty rates. If you're going to live longer, you're more likely to be poor because you'll spend down all your assets and things, but we don't get you sort of any benefit from that. That doesn't show up. And I'd rather live long and be poor than die early with all my money. Okay, so just to sum up it all, it's been a very positive story for the elderly. Those changes are dramatic. We've done really well. You can argue how well we did in the war on poverty for the population as a whole, but there's no question that for the elderly, the gains have been dramatic. But if you stop to think about it, how did we achieve that? We gave them money, right? Social Security just increased and increased and increased. We gave people money. They weren't poor anymore. That's one way to fix it. We could give everybody money and nobody would be poor, but it'd be nice to do some other things, maybe pension reforms, things like that. Okay, we know Social Security is facing financial difficulties, so there are going to be changes. It's not something we'll be able to count on lifting as many people out of poverty as it used to. There's still groups left behind, elderly immigrants. Remember, Social Security now depends on 35 years of work. If you have a bunch of zeros in those, because you didn't come to this country until you were 50, you're going to have lower Social Security benefits, and you'll be more likely to be poor. Legal immigrants may not be entitled to supplemental security income in many states. There are persistently high poverty rates for women living alone, particularly among minority women. And so what do we think about going forward? One of the issues is we are shifting from those defined benefit pension plans where you had this guaranteed income for life to one where you save up for yourself, these 403Bs, 401Ks, and you have to decide how to spend down that money. If people do really well, they'll be better off. If they mess up, make mistakes, the market goes down, they'll be worse off. And what are we going to do to people if they reach age 70 and they've done a really bad job in investing and have nothing? Are we going to bail them out? There's also a big issue about fraud. You can trade everything online, right? With a few keystrokes, you can send all your money to some email that comes online saying somebody needs help getting money out of some country. And Fidelity and Vanguard are worried about this. Are they going to be responsible if somebody trades away their entire retirement savings? What if the home health aide that comes to take care of grandpa sees the password sitting next to the computer and does something? Or what if his children do something? There's a potential for real fraud in this market. There are going to be declines in Social Security and Medicare. We can't afford them anymore. And the big issue that I'm addressing is long-term care. Nursing homes are not covered by Medicare. Nursing homes now average $90,000 a year. Very few people have the resources to pay for that. People have fewer children to care for them, and children are working full-time and can't care for them. So we've done a lot of things to correct for this. Private pension plans used to be the case that one of those reasons elderly widows were so poor, when their husband died, they lost their pension. The pension died with him. They passed a first law saying pensions have to offer survivorship benefits for widows. That didn't do much, so they passed a second law that said that's the default. Your spouse has to sign away the right to survivorship benefits if you don't want them, otherwise you get them. Okay, there are health improvements that are allowing people to work longer, and we saw that uptick in labor force participation, so that's a good sign for the future. People will work longer. There are now technological improvements that make people able to live alone much longer, which is a really good thing if you want to maintain your independence. And we're starting to talk, part of the Affordable Care Act was something called the Class Act to provide for long-term care coverage in your own home. That did not get enacted, it was not done well. But we're starting to think as a country about how we deal with long-term care issues. So, thank you very much.
This is on already. Thank you so much. There's so much to ask about, and so there's another microphone over there if you want to go over there and get ready to ask a question, or I can bring it around. I'm going to take advantage of having one in my hand and be able to ask you one or two myself. The first question is, you showed that graph that showed the different levels of poverty between the elderly, the working age, and the children. Are there lessons from what you've been doing in terms of your research that we could apply, for example, to think about reducing child poverty? Are there things we could take from these 50 years of experience and apply it to reducing child poverty?
Well, I think one of the discouraging parts about this gain in the well-being of the elderly isn't that we could, it would be nice if we convinced all sorts of people to save. We had these tax advantage things like 401ks, 403bs. People really took care of themselves and did that. People were healthier. We had better employment opportunities for the elderly, and they were working longer, earning more. The way we got this reduction in poverty is by giving money to the elderly. Social Security spent a huge amount of money. It spent money it didn't have. So we can spend money on welfare for children, for anybody, and that will help. I think what we learned from the elderly, even though it's not sustainable forever, we can't have these enormous increases in Social Security forever. So we want to come up with a plan that's sustainable forever. So investing more in education so parents can take better care of their children, better child care so parents can go to work. Something that really is sustainable on that rather than just spending money. Money works, right? We could raise welfare benefits to above the poverty line and everybody who gets welfare wouldn't be poor. And we could decide that that's something important. And economists are very good at telling you how things work. We don't make policy decisions. Like we could decide that there should be a minimum income for everybody in the country. We could do it. And is that something you want to do? You have to cut back somewhere. And everything's a trade-off. If you want to guarantee something make sure every single child has income above the poverty line, you can give every single child that income, and then you have to cut back somewhere else. And you decide what the trade-off is. So it's nice if you can find a way to invest a little money and get a big return. And I think things like education and childcare would do that, but that's my opinion, and there's no simple answer.
Oh, I thought there was. No. I'm going to ask one more question, and then Mike or whoever can ask some more. You didn't say a lot about Medicare because you said that isn't counted in there, but I wanted to ask you, one idea that was floating around a lot in 2009, 2010, when the Affordable Care Act was being debated was, why don't we just have Medicare for everybody? Instead of doing this Affordable Care Act or something like that. So again, from the 50 years that we've had Medicare and the research you've done, because you've done beyond what you talked about here, would that work? Is that a dumb idea, or what do you think?
I think it's a very good idea. People love Medicare, right? There's that famous political sign with "Tell the government to take their hands off my Medicare." right? If you ask the elderly, they're really happy with Medicare. It's a single-payer plan, right? It's what people think they don't want, but it's worked. It's very efficient. It's been able to bargain to reduce prices and so forth. I think it would have been a very easy process to get to universal health insurance by expanding Medicare a little bit at a time. A lot of people object to single payer. The plan we came up with, I wasn't there, I had nothing to do with it. The plan the country came up with, the Affordable Care Act, is trying to get the private sector. So when you go into the health insurance exchanges and you buy health insurance coverage through the Affordable Care Act, you're buying it from a private insurance provider. So we're keeping the private insurance companies involved in our Medicare, in our medical care. And some people very strongly argue that we have to let the private market do it, and the private market is more efficient. Other people make the argument having a single payer is far more efficient. I come down on I like the single payer, but that's not something that's been politically viable. There's a lot of objection to it, and that's a sort of policymaker type decision. Medicare functions very well.
Katie has a microphone, Mike has a microphone, Andy can ask a question, of course, but raise your hand and I'll bring a microphone to you.
I was going to say I wanted to ask a question real quick. First off, thank you for coming tonight. And then I wanted to ask, you talked quite a bit about how we measure poverty and how that might not be a good measurement. If you had infinite power in the universe and you could kind of revise how we measure poverty, especially among the elderly, what in particular would you like to see changed?
That's a really hard question. One of the advantages of the poverty line, for all its faults, it was sort of random, done in 1961, things have changed. It gives us a consistent measure over time. If we want to see how many people are below a certain threshold, we have a consistent measure going back to 1959. That helps for lots of things you want to do, right? If you want to know how we're doing on this part of the income distribution, we have a very clear measure. Many of the countries in Europe define poverty as below 1/2 the median income. Median income is the middle part of the distribution, exactly the 50th percentile. Take half of that, oops, for you guys, half of that, and see how many people fall below that. What our method has is we could grow everybody out of poverty, right? There could be nobody below that number. If you're taking half the median income, you'll never be out. There'll never be nobody below half the median income. So it does have advantages. It gives you a consistent measure over time, which lets you really sort of chart progress. Any of these other methods would change, but there has been several commissions set up to measure poverty. The current favored one is one that basically subtracts medical care expenses from your income, but doesn't do anything else. I would like to include owner-occupied homes. That's a huge difference. Maybe it's my bias coming from Los Angeles, where if you can have a home that's worth $3 million that's paid off and you paid $25,000 for it or something, there's no geographic variation in it. So the poverty rate is the same here as it is in New York City or something like that. Economists are conflicted about what to do about that because it costs more to live in Los Angeles than it does here. Well, you have more days of sunshine. You don't have to pay fuel costs to heat your house. You don't have to pay air conditioning to cool your house. You don't have to worry about shoveling snow. Produce is much cheaper. So there's different trade-offs, and it's very hard to do this everywhere. So I'm not sure I do have an ideal plan. I would do something with owner-occupied homes. I would do something with implicit income from savings. I would do something about the value of Medicare and Medicaid. That's probably $8,000 or $10,000 a year, which would get all the elderly out of poverty immediately. So then you'd have to change that line. There's nothing good. Everything's going to have problems. So right now, sticking with something that's consistent, I don't think is a bad idea, as long as we recognize what's behind it. Because any one of these things you do, there's going to be 100 other problems that pop up.
Just want to say, great presentation so far. My question is related to
until now.
We'll see how you answer this tricky question. It's related to the public pension crisis. And financing all these great programs that you talked about. And so as life expectancy has increased, all the people in the room, besides maybe Father Rene, have been the burden's been increased to finance the people who qualify for these programs like SSI and Social Security. And I was wondering if you could talk about some solutions. In one of your slides, you kind of alluded to one that the value that the older people who qualify for these programs will receive will go down. But there are other solutions, like maybe they'll charge us more, the youth in the room, or maybe they'll find other sources of funding. I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Sure. Social Security, we all hear about Social Security going bankrupt and things like that. Social Security is easy to fix. I actually think, there you go. So you can increase the payroll tax by just 1.7 percentage points. That'll solve probably the problem for 75 years. Raise it by 3.2 percentage, it'll solve the problem forever. Basically, you could increase the income maximum, and that'll solve just about all the problems. What we're likely to do is some combination. We'll increase the retirement age somewhat. Right now it's increasing to 67. We'll increase it further. Life expectancy has increased a lot. If we're smart, we'll index it to life expectancy like some European countries have done, so we don't have to vote this again. We'll increase taxes somewhat. We are probably increase the tax base. We may cut benefits somewhat to people with higher incomes. We'll do a whole bunch. If we had started this long ago, it would have been much easier. We waited too long, but it's pretty easy to fix. One of the problems with increasing the age of collecting benefits is there are jobs which you can't work to age 70. Very physically intensive jobs you can't. So any Social Security reform is going to have to take into account something like the Social Security Disability Program, which provides help for people who can't work because they're disabled, and extend it to jobs that are too difficult. You can't have coal miners, at 70, or ditch diggers, or things that are really hard. So you'll have to do it, any Social Security form, part and parcel with a SSDI, disability form, but it's not a big deal to fix. Even if we do nothing, Social Security will pay out 75% of its benefits going forward, forever. So it's not a big deal. The big deal is Medicare. We have no idea what to do about Medicare. It's a huge problem. Every economist can give you their favorite version of the combination of these, and we'll do one of them. Nobody can tell you what to do to fix Medicare. Healthcare costs just keep going up and up and up. We basically can't give everybody everything. All countries in the world ration healthcare in some way. We ration it by ability to pay. Other countries ration it with long queues. Other countries ration it by you can't get the latest and greatest titanium hip. You can't. If we wanted to, we could afford to give everybody everything, but we have to cut back on something else. Do you cut back on education? Do you cut back on roads? Do you cut back on military? Where do you cut back to do that? So we'll cut back on healthcare somewhat, I think, to afford it, and it's just how we do it. How do we want to ration it? Do we want to say, if you get Medicare, you can't get this really new experimental cancer drug, like they do in England or something, or you can't get this, or you have to wait 6 months, or you have to pay a greater fraction, but that's hard. Social Security is easy.
How did that the threshold of where you don't pay above X dollars, how did that first come into fruition?
It was just a compromise. You didn't need all those taxes. For a long time, Social Security was building up these enormous trust funds, and this was a political compromise on taxes. We won't tax everything, we'll tax you up. Medicare used to have that same limit too. When Medicare first ran into trouble, they got rid of the cap for Medicare, but they did not for Social Security. An easy way to fix Social Security is get rid of the cap for Social Security too.
Super easy.
Super easy.
Mathematically.
Yeah. Right. That's why I said Social Security, there's lots of ways to fix Social Security. And you find the one that balance, and they hurt different people. Right? Raising the retirement age hurts people who are in jobs where you can't work forever. Getting rid of the cap hurts people who have very high incomes. Different things. You get rid of the marriage subsidy. There are different things you can do.
Maybe Warren Buffett doesn't.
Right, and so what now they do is they tax Social Security benefits above a certain amount. So you can do something like that. You can not give Social Security to people of other income over $300,000. You can pick really high. There's lots of things, and you figure out, the policymakers have to figure out which of these they want to do. But it can be done. It's not an insurmountable problem, and Medicare is going to be the real hard one. And related to that, long-term care, because it's getting increasingly expensive. People don't have family members to provide care. As we've made huge progress in heart disease. Right? People are living forever with heart disease. They're surviving heart attacks. Once we beat cancer, and people can live with cancer for a long time, people are going to live long enough to get cognitive impairment. That's the really expensive long-term care issue, because you need round-the-clock care. And we don't have a good way to pay for that. Medicare doesn't cover it. We don't have national long-term care. Only about 12 to 15% of elderly have long-term care insurance. So right now, everything's provided informally by family members. And that's going to be very hard going forward with lower fertility rates, children who work full-time, children who live away from home. Other questions?
One more question. You said that the rate has dropped to 9.5%, is that right, among the elderly? The poverty rate
Poverty
is
rate, yeah,
9.5%.
yeah. Mhm.
How much what do we know about that 9.5%? That's a pretty low number. And I'm looking at those other numbers you put out. We've got people living alone longer. We've got people retiring early. And that SSI thing, I'm a social scientist, so of course I want to puzzle over the one thing you can't really figure out, and I want to keep puzzling with it. What is their story, the 9.5%, and not taking the government up on the SSI? Any speculation? Are they perhaps saturated? Maybe they're just not needing it.
It's really interesting. If you ask people with incomes around the poverty line what the poverty line should be, they give you a number below theirs. Because people are getting by, people have informal ways of making things work, and some people don't. In terms of who the poor are now, they're women, single women and minorities mostly. The poverty rate for married couples is about 5%. So the men are doing okay. It's after they die and you have single women, especially minority women, and they are well overrepresented in the poverty ranks.
Well, what I'm getting at is why aren't they taking the government up on the SSI?
Yeah,
They own their home.
It's really puzzling. They own their home. So, we saw 80% of the elderly own their home. That's counted. They're probably getting informal help from children and things like that. But they should see it from an economist standpoint, even if it's $5 a month, you should be doing it. $5 a month adds up over time. And people don't. There was a lot of speculation early on that this was the cohort that lived through the Great Depression without government assistance. They were not going to take government assistance, but we've sort of passed that cohort now and we have other people involved. There probably is, it's probably some of all of those. Some people don't know about the program, don't know how to apply. Social Security tries to make it really easy for you. You can get SSI if you're disabled, and that's hard. It's hard to prove you're disabled. The government can question it. You go to court and so forth. To prove that you're old, the Social Security Administration will get the birth certificate for you, and then you just show you have low income. But people might not know how to do it. So there's probably some stigma, some lack of knowledge, some thought that they don't need it, some of all of those. But no, I've done many calculations on that, several papers, and there's no clear answer.
But one more question, and it may just be that they are living well enough if they own their own
Right.
home and they're a single
But they
person.
still should, right? Even, if I'm eligible for free $20 a month, why don't we take it?
That's an economist.
Right. And so it's this belief that I don't want to accept extra money. I'm fine. I can do it on my own, right? Because it is free money, and there's sort of no reason not to take it, even if you're doing okay, except that you don't want to take money that you don't need. And that's kind of, this nice idea, but it's hard to imagine that people really are doing all that well when their income's below $10,000 a year or so. Anything else? Okay, great. Well, thank you very, very much.